we're going to talk about pest management now. I think what you actually find is a lot of the same theme from weed or disease management translate as pests as well. And I'm going to talk to you from a longtime gardener, farmer, not from an entomologist standpoint, I suppose. But same token, how I've always approached it was with the integrated pest management approach. So there's no one factor. It takes many different things along the way. So you could be looking at biological control, sanitation, cultural control, environment. Could be your crop selection, the growing system you choose, your site. So all these things end up factoring into your overall experience and knowledge of how you deal with the pests on your farm. So a big one is know your enemy. I mean, if you don't know your pests, it can be difficult to manage them, and knowing their life cycles, because you may end up targeting the pests at specific life cycles, but you see the egg, the larva, the pupa, the adult. Often a pest that can be very difficult to maybe kill as an adult is a lot easier to kill as an egg. Or if you look at something such as neem oil, you know, it can stop that transition from one stage to the next. So it's kind of knowing the life cycle of the pest you're dealing with, what stage in your growing of what the crops you're growing, of what cycle that pest is most detrimental to your crop. I mean, we could take something like a hornworm for tomatoes, which can be, you know, devastating to a tomato crop. However, the adult hornworms are a wonderful pollinator at the same time. So, you know, they're not maybe bad at one moment of their life, not so much as other. And this economic thresholds idea is very important, because definitely an organic management doesn't necessarily mean you have to be absent of all pests. And I want to point you out to this UCIPM online website, which is a great site to check out. Has probably any crop you want to grow. A nice one you can look up on there, though, is to find those economic thresholds. And what that's going to mean is a certain number of pests on your crop before they cause you a loss of revenue. So you can be surprised. Often that threshold can be quite high. So common pests that you could end up dealing with, and there's many, and they're definitely not all pictured on this screen, but you see the cabbage looper up there on the left, the stink bug, the hornworm, Japanese beetle, a very newly emerging one in the last several years, aphids, some others you may encounter, harlequin bug, asparagus beetle, your fruit growers, spiderwing Drosophila, and really the list goes on and on. If you grow a diverse number of crops, you're going to end up pretty much encountering all of them at some point. There's not many pests we don't have here in the Midwest. So there's definitely a role of plant health, and I think some of this goes in with the weed management as well. I mean, if you have a healthy crop growing quickly, doesn't have stress and pressure from temperature, drought, fertilizer management, that crop is going to be much more resilient to the pest pressure that it ends up seeing. So that's one of your first roles to think about. And also think about the environment you grow in. Maybe I kind of had this slide a little early, sorry, but your pests can change from your growing system, you know, whether you're outdoor production in the field or you're growing in high tunnels, and think of that climate control that you create differently. It doesn't rain inside a high tunnel. It's a very dry, deserty environment. So you can think of things like aphids or spider mites being a much larger problem in that sort of environment opposed to one that you see outside. Now, what you often see is when we get into periods like now where we get long stretches of no rain, you see a lot of the same problems popping up in the outdoor crops that you might find in a tunnel setting. So a lot of these things will sound familiar from the weed talk. First one being scouting. So you need to be out in the field often. I would say at least once a week, but it can often be every day. Just depending on your time situation. if you don't know you have a pest problem, then it's going to grow. And so it's like, even like the weeds, where you want to catch them early, catch when they're small. You'd like to be aware when the pests are showing up on your farm. And that can even take the form of, we'll talk a little bit into monitoring and trapping. You can have exclusion practices as well, and that can take the form of different nettings or different ways to keep pests off. Sanitation is critical, and that as well, solarization, biological controls, water sprays, and then usually you like to think of pesticides as your last option. So it takes a good plan, and you like to have a certain level, you'd like to know your protocols for pest management on your farm before you actually have a pest show up. Takes diligence, takes that IPM approach. You know, you're not going to solve your problems with pests just from one approach. I've often utilized degree day tracking. This coinciding bloom is part of a tracking system. So that if you're interested in that, I encourage you to look more into the readings about that. But that is, certain pests will show up when certain plants bloom, and you can kind of get an idea of when they're showing up. Same idea with degree day tracking. Big reason we do that is to, over time, to try to establish a time frame of when I should be watching for that pest. And you can find very good, you know, degree day tracking models, or other places doing it in other parts of the country, and often Michigan, you can find good models, but there's not a lot of good information for Missouri and Kansas, being that we're largely, you know, large agronomy crops, corn, soybean, and didn't establish a lot of these specialty crop tracking methods as much here. And then observing those thresholds, you know, and whenever you run to the resort of pesticide use, the label being very important to follow, and using proper PPE. And that often means long pants, long shirts, gloves, face mask, and be aware that anything you spray could have a detrimental impact on the farm. I run from the philosophy of, I don't want to kill off anything that could be my helper in the farm as well. So often in things that I have managed, we always have some level of insectaries to draw as many beneficials to the site or to the farm. And, you know, that could be in row, where this is hyssop growing under grapes, or this marigolds and chives growing under peaches. You see this clover growing along this high tunnel here. So we want to apply enough habitat, enough food for the beneficials to thrive, and also they want to provide, you know, not a sterile environment. The more diverse the environment, I would say you're thinking of less opportunity for one thing to become dominant. You know, if I have a very sterile environment where I have one crop and aphids can run wild, then that's the situation you end up running into. So you can do this by having buffer on the edges of your farm with insectaries like that, or you could do it through cover crops. Some of them mentioned, like the clover on the outside of the tunnel, or it could be mixed into your rotation. Maybe buckwheat, as Tom mentioned, being an excellent pollinator plant, could be worked into your rotation. Clover, some of these other options as flowering cover crops as well, beyond, you know, planting a perennial insectary. I was pointing out this assassin bug, just because it kind of was very prevalent in my mind this year. I've never seen so many assassin bugs on my property as I have this year. And talking with some others, it's possible that it's because we had such a large aphid infestation this spring. I think a lot of other growers, at least I've talked to, everyone said, I saw so many aphids this year. And some of that could have been the dry weather or how we came out of spring. But assassin bug larvae often feed on aphid eggs. And so they had a very healthy population, as long as it wasn't doing anything to kill off the assassin bugs. Now what I see on my farm is I see assassin bugs killing Japanese beetle, or I've seen them carrying off other harlequin bugs or blister beetles. I've seen them eating a cabbage looper. So always being conscious of the beneficials on your farm, the good guys that could be working for you, even if they look crazy as well. So scouting for pests is weekly at least, and you're establishing those thresholds as we mentioned. Check out that IPM guide from UC Davis and being conscious of the beneficials. I don't know, this is something I've encountered every year, but if you see this parasitic wasp eggs on this hornworm here in the bottom right corner, if you see something like that on your farm, that's something you would want to leave there, because that parasitic wasp has laid its eggs in there and then they fed, and as they hatch, they consume that, and then you get more. So as long as I'm not doing anything to damage the population of those parasitic wasps, you know, it could have very good control of my hornworm population over time as well, and not have to do too much to treatment on those. Real quick, I just want to back up for you, show you a few things. So when I mentioned tracking, this is from several years ago when I was doing a lot more degree day tracking. Everyone see that Excel sheet? So this is when I was tracking for mostly orchard pests. And if you see here on this Coddling moth, Oriental fruit moth, this peach tree borer, the Plum Curculio, what I've done is I've set traps out and then I'm checking those traps weekly and taking notice if I have trapped this insect. So over time, or different years, I get then the emergence state of the first, when I start to see them and when they build up. And then I can make choices on my management and knowing that I'm looking for that date. But, you know, say if I got Coddling moth in 2008, merging May 15th, in 2012, it was March 30th, 2013, it was back to May 15th. You know, see, there's fluctuation there. So I can't automatically say I'm going to treat Coddling moth on May 15th. You know, I need to do some yearly tracking, but I can also get a little bit of guidance on when I need to start looking for that. All right. And so off of some of that, I'm working off of a sheet like this where I've divided it into months. You know, if I'm in January, and these are the crops I'm growing. Say I go into March. Can you guys read that enough? And I kind of go, so looking at peach here on line 9, I'm looking for Oriental fruit moth, possible treatment being a pheromone trap. And so, you know, you get so busy farming, whether you're planting, harvesting, you know, it's nice to be able to refer to some sheet of things you should be looking out for that month. And because when you got enough time going with your pest, your weed management, your disease management, something you can refer to over time that can give you a little bit of better sense. That's something I've done. It's not necessarily for everyone, but I'll show you that. And one last one. So these are, this is how I've tracked trap catches. So I was trapping peach tree borer, checking them week, and then hopefully getting to a trend where I can see what the count in the traps is and make decisions. So based on this, I'll start treating trunks, you know, as the pour is showing up, little greater incident there in June, you see with more trap catches and early on, and they taper off, the trap catches taper off as the year goes by. So beyond taking care of the beneficials, next options we have is exclusion or physical barriers. So being one thing that these can incur quite cost, however, they are extremely effective, but it is right that costly but effective. But in my mind, in a lot of ways, they are worth it depending on which pests you're going. I mean, especially in high tunnel or greenhouse settings, to be able to exclude the pests from that region is quite good. These come in the form of row covers or insect screens. they could be on the side of a high tunnel side of the greenhouse, but they could also just be draped over a plant or over a hoop. Some things to watch for, these are very effective in flea beetle management early in the season for spinach or arugula. They are very effective in early season cabbage looper on your brassicas, very effective on your squash bug control. Now, if you're growing zucchini and you're covering them for squash bug, you got to pay attention to your variety you're growing. That's where your choices come in on your crop selection. If I cover and I exclude that squash bug from my zucchini plant, but I keep the cover on once the plant starts flowering, I'm not going to get pollination. But if I choose a parthenocarpic variety, which does not need pollination, I can leave that row cover on, and then I can just uncover from harvest. And often just having that row cover early in the season, and you can get very good harvests and never have to treat for a squash bug or a cucumber beetle. But that row cover, it's only going to last maybe last a season, maybe last a couple of years. The cost benefit analysis on your farm. Something to watch for this always is overheating. So when you put insect cover on a high tunnel, you put it on a greenhouse, you reduce the airflow that can pass through there. So maybe a little bit, just enough to keep a hornworm from out of the tunnel or a cucumber beetle out. Maybe you have enough airflow, but if you're trying to exclude something small like a thrip or a spider-winged Drosophila, you might restrict the airflow so much that you need to have some sort of forced airflow then in that tunnel. Same thing if you're doing low hoops or just on the cover, and yet you're getting into hot summer days. Depending on your choice that you've made here, you may have to, you could have a benefit that you overheat that, or a detriment that you maybe overheat that crop as well. So it's something to watch for. I've done these sort of nylon pantyhose type socks on fruit before. That's just another form of excluding a pest, keeping from spraying. You'll see this widely done in Japan, actually, like whole orchards done. It's time consuming to put that on the fruit, but it's very effective as well. And then no more, I'm not having to spray anymore. We've seen people do this even. So you see this row cover here going over these transplants before they go out in the field on cover, but this could cause overheating as well. Something else I like to pay attention to is when I have all these transplants having to go in the field, this is often a great time to limit the amount of spray or cover I need. So something I have this many flats of brassicas here. If I can spray all this couple hundred of brassicas with a BT in a matter of minutes with a very small amount of a tank, rather than if I put them in the field. So I might, or another product called Surround, which we'll talk a little bit later, I could spray those on now as well. And then I could spray them all at once, very quick, very easy. And then I can plant them in the field and I can have that first 7-10 days, maybe up to 2 weeks of protection on those plants. Because what often happens to me is when I plant brassicas is I maybe lose some to cutworms right away, or I don't want to get those early pests on those young plants because they can't handle that early pest pressure as well. If I get the plant in the ground, get it established, growing well, then it can handle a much higher threshold of pest pressure than it does when it's young. So yeah, mentioning Surround is, if you don't know, it's kaolin clay. It goes into this, I group it into the exclusion category, much like row cover, because it's creating a physical barrier on the plant. You could probably consider as a cheaper alternative than row cover. However, a little more work to deal with. It's not that easy to spray. It clogs up your sprayers. You got to be diligent about cleaning things out. It washes off in the rain, so you would have to reapply. but it's going to be much cheaper than row cover, and it's going to achieve a lot of your same effects without the overheating risk, and it can actually cool plants and prevent sunburn in them a lot and transplant shock. So it creates this physical barrier on the plant and will actually flake off on the pest and irritate the pest, so it doesn't want to be on there. That complete coverage and the timing is important. You know, you want to be on there before the pest really starts to show up in 2 hive numbers, and you have to be reapplying. This is referencing an application I did for plum, is what those spring applications are. So that's kind of what you can see it in fruit orchard wise, and as you can imagine, this doesn't necessarily create like something you just can take to market right away. You do have to wash this off. But often this is more like you would use this early in the growing season, spring, and then by the time you harvest this fruit, it's going to kind of be worn off by then already. But what I've used kaolin clay mostly for is in fruit production more so than vegetable, though I've seen it used in tomato and peppers and some other, and I have used it on brassica crops kind of early in the season. And as well as I've sprayed it on the bases of zucchini and cucumber. Helps keep vine borer out, helps keep that squash bug initially off. Moving on from exclusion, sanitation being a very key for pests. So this is anywhere from plant debris or weeds, any decaying fruit, produce, which is also a problem in your disease category, and you're trying to limit anything that can harbor more of those pests. Now, I would say there's a line here you don't cross so much where, you know, beneficials need plant habitat as well. So, you know, so it's not I don't necessarily go around and just clearing every place on my farm and remove all leaf piles and everything. You know, you have to leave something for beneficials to hide out in as well. But, you know, I'm not going to leave some damaged zucchini plants in the, on my ground, or I'm not going to leave, you know, aphid-ridden broccoli plants. You're going to want to remove those from your growing site. Now, they could be shredded up, they could be composted, but it's something to observe. Same with weeds pressure. Not only, as Tom's talking about, it can hurt into the growth of your crop. Weeds are often host plants for harboring pests. So he mentioned pigweed. Pigweed is often where you will find large populations of blister beetles. So if I have a lot of pigweed on a farm, I can expect to have a lot of blister beetles, and then they can move in to another crop. As well as tall grass, you know, on my perimeters, kind of depending on my mowing, at least can often create much higher numbers of grasshoppers. So they'll come out of that and then feed ferociously and kind of go back and forth. So I at least maintain some sort of mowing perimeter around some places I'm growing. And then I somewhat put this, well, not somewhat, but this, the collection of pests put into the sanitation. You see this bug vacuum here. I actually have not used a bug vacuum, so to say, but I have done a lot of hand collection of pests. So, I mean, this could be anywhere from squash bug, from Japanese beetle, going out, hand collecting, which is often, so one of the first things I do. I'll do hand collecting before the populations get too high, before I have to spray. You know, if my exclusion methods haven't worked, then I collect. I have beneficials, encouraging beneficials, then I get to where I spray. I want to say something about this collection too is I don't necessarily have slides on this, but I have done a fair amount of trap cropping or exclusion, you know, planting. A good example is blue Hubbard squash. Planting it on the perimeter of a field will attract more of the squash bugs than your standard zucchini. So if you can imagine, if you plant a trap crop and then do more of your management in the trap crop rather than your cash crop. That can be beneficial. And sanitation could be a way. I mean, you could even burn down those plants once they become infested before they've moved into your greater part of the field. This can be very effective in high tunnel maintenance. So if you imagine once we've had a crop done, we're harvesting, you want to pull all that debris out, plant clean. And this isn't for every situation. You know, I've had high tunnels where I have large mulches of leaves and wood mulch as well, but you know, you still can clean off as much of that debris, removing all that, as much of the debris that could be harvesting pests. But you can take those moments between crops to do a good cleaning, just like anything, and you get most of that debris out, and then you can close up those sides of the tunnel, close up that wall, really heat up that space really high. You can kill off a lot of remaining bugs. You're probably not going to get 100% kill, but you can get a good amount of killing off of any live insects in there. Some biological controls. I think probably many of you have known before, you know, ladybugs eat aphids. There's almost a parasitic wasp for every major pest. There's the assassin bug mentioned that is a kind of ferocious eater of, it's not very selective. It'll eat many different pests. I've utilized nematodes in many situations as well. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the, for grub control. Anyways, sorry about that. But there's only a few sites that, this one being IPM Labs, I've ordered from Arbico, Organics, I've ordered from Great Plains, IPM. Like I said, mostly what I've used is, I haven't had in my own situation, haven't had to really release ladybugs. I've usually had enough of a population of ladybugs that I haven't had to release them. And this might sound counterintuitive, but one way I've done that is often I've left food for them. If there is nothing for them to eat, you won't have much of a population. So I have occasionally grown like on the outskirts or on the side, and maybe kale, maybe broccoli, I've harvested off that, but then I've left it to the bugs. And the aphids maybe have taken up enough control of that plant that then you often see, as long as you're not killing them off, is large populations of ladybugs come in to feed on them. And once they're done there, move into the other parts of the farm. But I have applied nematodes, and I haven't had to buy in parasitic wasps, but you certainly can. Now, same thing, you want to be able to supply food for them. These things, I think anything that you could spray could end up killing off what you're trying to buy in. They tend to be pretty expensive, in fact, but you can gain very good controls with them. Tend to be more effective in those high tunnel greenhouse settings than they do just in overall farm settings. But I'll mention a forceful water spray. It's one of the simplest methods to gain credit, and that sounds just what it is. I mean, you're just hosing the plants down. There may be a path here where you got to think about disease pressure with having wet plants, but if you do this early in the morning, say I have whiteflies, I have aphids, I have mites, often a good forceful blast of water, and I'm not talking about just one time, you're gonna need to follow it up a few times, can often keep that population at enough bay that it's not a problem. And it doesn't mean you don't lose some of your crop. That's why it's looking at that economic threshold. But it's definitely not anything that's gonna be detrimental to your beneficials as well. And sometimes it's good to hose off some of that dust and things that can collect in those dry environments anyways. And then I like to think as the pesticide as sort of the end result. You know, once I've done these things and then I still need an extra help. Many types, I gotta say it's always important to follow the label, but you could be looking at soaps and oils, biological agents, And I think it's very important to rotate what you spray, so you're not building up different resistances, and you'll find them much more effective. So same thing in weed management. The timing of your spray is crucial. As we mentioned, you have to know the life cycle of the pest you're targeting. You want to know that what you're spraying even targets that pest, but as well as I always spray early in the morning or right at night. One thing, little less activity from pollinators. Another is I'm trying to avoid leaf burn, phytotoxicity on the plants as well. If the temperature is going to get above 85 within like the next hour, I want to make sure I've stopped spraying by then. The temperature will end up causing burning, and also just I don't want to spray during full sun. So either early in the morning, and I'm usually means I need to be done by probably 10 o'clock or so, or late in the afternoon going into evening. Because not only because of those reasons mentioned, but there's often a reentry interval associated with whatever you're spraying. It could be, it could be 6 hours, 4 hours, could be 12 hours, depending on what your choice is. It's very important to have complete coverage. If I don't get adequate coverage on the plant, then I'm not doing an effective spray and necessarily reaching enough plants, and too many pests survive then the spray and I quickly have an infestation, or I've made a possible route towards more resistance. And then that frequency is, and often the label will tell you it can be sprayed every 4 days, can be sprayed every 7 days, whatever that be, or a max applications for the season. And then that's where it's something good to know something about the life cycle of your pest too. I know that pest has a life cycle of 11 days. I've sprayed, there's no reason for me to spray 7 days from now, if I'm not reaching that life cycle. So we'll go into a few specifics here as we go in. Caterpillars and worms, the most common spray probably have used is BT, which is a toxin produced by bacteria. Spinosad, another one, and have used neem oil. And I usually go into pyganic or some as a last resort. Soft-bodied insects tend to be easier to kill in the organic world. These being your spider mites, your aphids, your whiteflies, potato beetles. Much easier to kill just with insecticidal soaps or potassium salts, fatty acids like oils, spinosad. A lot easier to kill, we'll just say that, and much easier to hose off. Where it's the hard-bodied insects, being some of your beetles and your squash bugs, your stink bugs, these things are much harder to kill in the organic realm. That's why often I do more of my hosing off with water and then like soaps on my soft-bodied insects. And the hard bodies, I spend much more of my resources in exclusion and trapping, collecting, because they're a lot harder to kill in the pyganic world, and even in the organic world. Pyganic even has a difficult time penetrating the shells. What I've had to often do is you may be doing a tank mix of an insecticidal soap with a pyganic to sort of break down that maybe layer and then get something in that will kill it. I'm sure over your time you're going to come across many different formulas of different oils, garlics or hot pepper sprays. All these things can prove somewhat effective. All these have sort of, if they fit into your system, there's definitely need to be tested with leaf burning as anything you choose. So a couple more specifics. When I've used pyganic, if not familiar with it, is derived from chrysanthemums. There is permethrin in the conventional world of the synthetic thing, but for the organic rounds, you need it kind of this directly derived. It will supply pretty much immediate death, that rapid knockdown of a wide range of pests. But some of the downsides, it's very expensive. Any beneficial it encounters, it will kill off. Has a 12-hour re-entry. So, you know, it had to be off-site, can't no more work in that area. Some of those benefits can be used on the day of harvest though, which, I mean, as long as you're 12 hours later, I suppose. Very important on pyganic as well as spinosad BT is to buffer the mix of the pH. So most of the water I encounter and the sites I've worked on, you're looking at 8.5, yeah, even higher. So if I don't buffer that mix down with an acid down to 5.5 to 7, that pyganic, that spinosad is not going to be nearly as effective as it could be. Spinosad, which is a Monterey garden insect spray, is kind of the brand I've used in the past, but that rate of 4 tablespoons per gallon. This is one that you have to pay attention to. I can only apply it 6 times in a season. I've sprayed collie moth, Colorado potato beetle, flea beetle, blister beetle, cabbage loopers, and harlequin bugs with it. What I've often used spinosad is where I'm using it as a rotation out of BT, because I'd rather use BT for my cabbage loopers, maybe 2 times, but then have a rotation of spinosad after the kill off, maybe some of those ones that made it through. This one, key point, that last sentence, it is highly toxic to bees if they get sprayed on them. So it's something to be very cognizant of, especially if you have hives on your farm to use. Neem oil is something I've used extensively. I don't tend to like an extract. I prefer this pure neem oil base, and what I've done in tree-wise is using a 5% concentration as a drench on trees before leaf, but that 5% concentration will burn leaves. So then I'll switch to a 0.5% as I have leaves and flowers present. This formula here on this 4-gallon backpack sprayer of 2.5 ounce neem, teaspoon of soap emulsifier, then these EM1 microbes, the molasses, the liquid fish. That's a formula I got off from Michael Phillips from the apple grower, and of course took through him. And something, if you're not familiar with using pure neem, it's not that easy to work with. Say neem oil kind of solidifies as temperatures get cool, so it can be a little harder to work with in early season. It also, you usually need to emulsify it first in that soap, and then mix it with some warm water before I add it to the tank mix with some of the cooler water. So I want to maintain a certain temperature, or it's going to really gel up and clog up the sprayers. It's another one that has to have diligent cleaning of the sprayers, like Surround afterwards. What I've kind of ended up going towards is I kind of dedicate a Surround sprayer, a neem oil sprayer, that you, instead of using it for anything else. A couple crop specific pests, just to give you an example of like my thinking as I've gone through. Asparagus beetle is one I've dealt with and causes this browning, the scarring, the shepherd's crook. You kind of see if you've grown asparagus. That threshold I'm watching for when I'm scouting is that 1 out of 10 plants have an adult, or 50% have a larvae. You say, how do I know if they have a larvae? Well, I'm looking for that crook. And so that there's a picture of an adult, if I've seen, at least one of them on 10 plants. There's the eggs that I can find, and there's a parasitic wasp that can actually help control. And then that shepherd's crook I'm watching for. So as long as I'm going out and I'm inspecting the plants at least once a week, and I'm probably, in asparagus season, I'm harvesting more than once a week, so I should be able to make my observations then. I'm watching out for these things. So if I know I have asparagus beetle, then what I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure I'm diligent about my sanitation. I'm going to clean all the debris up to make sure there's no leftover eggs that are on the stems of the asparagus. So I'm going to let that asparagus dry down, send its roots down, have maybe some winter cover for a little bit, but before I enter the next season, I'm definitely going to cut all that old growth away and remove it from site, maybe the burn pile. And what I've actually gotten into the habit of doing is, after I've cut that, is actually giving a bit of dual weed pest management. I've done a flame weeding over the asparagus patch to, one, you know, I can burn off any weeds, but I can also maybe burn up any eggs that could have maybe fallen and maybe have fallen, and then I can follow it up with the flame weeding, you know, a couple weeks later as well. Maybe I can catch some larvae down in the soil or not. Maybe, maybe not, but I'm at least controlling some of my weed pressure at the same time. So I always, beyond my sanitation methods, I always start with hand picking the beetles as I see them, you know, because like most pests, they show up in small numbers at first, kind of observe, you know, and you get to a peak season. So, as, you know, if I'm out there early enough and I'm removing, I can knock the eggs off my harvested asparagus spears. I can usually keep good control early, you know, but if the population increases and I got to have a knockback, I've used pyganic if they overwhelm me, and I've also used potassium salts of fatty acids as a rotation on that. I have done this neem oil soil drench, so in the fall or in early spring. So what, as I said, neem oil stops the transition to the next stage, or that from the egg to larvae to adult. And so if I do a soil drench and I can kill them in the ground as an egg, or I can kill them in the ground as a larvae, then can knock that population back. I've also had good experience using, I don't have it on here, but using nematodes to control asparagus beetle as well. So coddling moth was a major pest of apple and pear I've had to deal with. It's kind of that #1 cause of wormy apples. It's a big one, often 3 generations in our region. So I think kind of we saw some of the tracking that we saw from those sheets before, using those traps to monitor. So the target degree days I'm looking at is 250, 1170, and 2000. So if you're not familiar with tracking degree days, all I'm doing is taking the max temperature for today and the minimum temperature. Take that plus and divide by 2, minus the base temp, which is, I believe, is 50, and then that's giving my daily degree day. So starting on January, I do that. Maybe I don't accrue any degree days, you know, but until your temperature gets warm, but I start to add them up. When I've hit, you know, and you saw that on that previous sheet, you know, that happened in March or it happened in May, that changed, but this number of 250 or 1170, that number's the same, what I'm looking for that first generation, second generation. It's just the date it falls on can fluctuate a little bit the year. So in combination with these degree days and then traps, can get a good idea of the population of coddling moths showing up. And so there's a picture of the trap. So the trap is a combination of a sticky card and then a pheromone lure. So I'm trying to lure in, trap males and kind of get an idea of when they thing. There are some pheromone disruption traps as well. So you overload the pheromones in the orchard, and it kind of confuses the moth to where then it can't really find what it's looking for. Here's a picture of a coddling moth. If you haven't seen one before, some of the damage they cause, and it lays that eggs and then bores in. So as you mate, exclusion, definitely very good at keeping out a coddling moth infection. But otherwise, what I've used is neem oil. The neem oil is effective because the neem oil kills when the coddling moth comes in and lays an egg. If you have good neem oil coverage, and you know when the coddling moth's in the orchard, so I'm not wasting my spray, the neem oil will kill the egg that the coddling moth has laid. Now I've also used Surround as well, and I've mixed neem oil into the Surround to as well. And so the surround is going to irritate, one, the moth on landing. It's also going to irritate when that egg hatches and then the larvae starts to try to want to burrow into the apple. Well, it's going to have the surround flake off on it, and it's going to irritate it. As a backup as well is possible BT. But I'd rather try to get with the neem oil and surround first before I go to the BT. Because the while BT sounds extremely safe, all that, it is not, it kills all caterpillars. You know, it's not just going to kill the Coddling mouth caterpillar. So it's possible that it could kill, you know, a certain other butterflies that we're trying to have in the area as well. Second generation, then looking at using that BT and spinosad, BT and spinosad on the third generation. Some of that is why I'm switching there is I could maintain a neem oil surround, but I'm having more leaf coverage, more risk of burning with the neem oil. I just have to watch what I'm doing. Plum Curculio is one I've had to deal with a lot, and that makes that horseshoe. And that's where this weevil, it's injected its egg into the fruit and it kind of makes that horseshoe scar there. And then what happens, it will hatch in there and then it'll eat from the inside out and that fruit will drop and rot. This comes into plant health. Often if you have a very quick growing, healthy fruit, it will grow so quick, it crushes the egg of the Plum Curculio and you get a little scar there. Now that comes into, well, you know, it's not an imperfect fruit for your market, but that organic gardening, it could have a blemish. There's something wrong with this fruit. It survived the Plum Curculio, has scar, still, it's just a little spot to cut out. So kind of depends on your market. Cabbage loopers can cause devastating damage. They just feed ferociously, if you haven't seen them before. And so mainly what I use on them is they're not that big of a problem in the spring if you plant early using frost blanket and get your crops in early, because it takes a little bit of heat before they show up. But using that row cover to keep them off early and then do some initial inspections where I'm picking some of the early ones off. They're very hard to see though. You can see they're so green, they are difficult to scout for. And then you can also find some of their eggs they've laid and sort of rub them off. But then going towards the BT and the spinosad rotation, if the population warrants it. I do want to say something about climate impact on pests. As they're often, we could think about them showing up earlier and staying longer if we move into warmer climates. When you're tracking those degree days, it's about building up life cycles and heat units. So if we build up those heat units earlier in the season, that pest emergence could move earlier and earlier, as well as pests like cucumber beetle, pests like spotted winged Drosophila you see on that raspberry, which have very short life cycles and really ramp up their populations as weather warms. If it warms up earlier, they show up earlier, they speed up their life cycles, and we become overwhelmed with that pest in much larger numbers in a hotter environment, as well as just stress on plants from heavier rains or periods of drought and higher temp. And now that's all I have for you, and hopefully can answer any questions that you have as well.